The city of Dublin in the early 2000s was alive with two very different rhythms. On one hand, it was the age of the Celtic Tiger, when Ireland's economy was booming, new skyscrapers were rising, and people were tasting prosperity like never before. On the other hand, beneath this glittering new face of Dublin, the city's darker heartbeat echoed through the neighborhoods of the Northside. These were areas where poverty, unemployment, and crime were deeply rooted, and where young men often saw two paths ahead of them: either struggle through the system and hope for stability, or embrace the underworld where quick money, fast cars, and instant respect were waiting. It was here, in this restless environment, that Eamon Dunne began carving out his story. He would become known as the Dawn of Dublin's North Side, a figure both feared and admired, whose rise in the 2000s was tied directly to the violent, lucrative world of drug trafficking. His life wasn't simply about crime. It was about ambition, influence, betrayal, and the tragic fate that often comes with gangster life. But before the headlines, before the whispers on Dublin's streets, Eamon Dunne was just another boy trying to survive in a tough city. Dunne was born and raised in Cabra, a working-class neighborhood of Dublin's North Side. Cabra was known for its tight-knit community, its rows of modest houses, and its hard realities. For many families, making ends meet was a daily challenge. Kids grew up fast in Cabra. They learned quickly how the world worked. Respect had to be earned, weakness could be exploited, and reputation meant survival. Young Eamon understood this early. Those who knew him as a child remembered him as sharp, ambitious, and restless. He wasn't the kind to sit quietly in the background. There was always a drive in him to stand out, to be somebody. By his teenage years, Dunne was already on the radar of local authorities. Like many young men in Cabra, he got involved in petty crime, stealing cars, fighting, and low-level drug dealing. But unlike most, Dunne's appetite for more was obvious. He wasn't satisfied with small money. He watched the older gangsters who drove expensive cars, wore designer clothes, and commanded fear and respect on the streets. He wanted that life, and he wanted it fast. The streets were his classroom, and he studied carefully. He learned who controlled which part of Dublin, who could be trusted, and who would sell you out. The Dublin underworld during the late 1990s and early 2000s was in transition. Older figures who once dominated the scene were fading, either locked up or killed, leaving gaps in the hierarchy. The drug trade was exploding as cocaine and heroin flooded Ireland, brought in by international cartels and distributed by local gangs. Violence was never far away. Turf wars, revenge attacks, and contract killings were becoming part of everyday headlines. For someone like Dunne, it was both a dangerous and golden opportunity. He was ambitious enough to see that if he could climb the ladder quickly, he could control the most profitable markets in the city. Dunne's rise wasn't overnight, but it was steady. He developed a reputation for being ruthless when necessary, but also clever in building alliances. He wasn't the stereotypical hot-headed thug who acted without thinking. He planned moves, calculated risks, and understood the importance of keeping both fear and loyalty balanced in his circle. His charisma drew younger men to him, people who wanted to be part of something bigger, who wanted protection and money. To them, Dunne wasn't just a gangster. He was a leader, someone who offered a sense of belonging. By the early 2000s, whispers of his growing influence were spreading across Dublin's Northside. He was no longer just a small-time criminal. He was becoming a figure with power. He moved into drug distribution, controlling supplies of cocaine, ecstasy, and cannabis. The profits were immense, fueling a lifestyle that made him stand out. Expensive cars began appearing outside his home. Nights in clubs were marked by big spending, and his image as a rising star of Dublin's criminal world was cemented. But beneath the surface of this success was the constant reality of danger. The world Dunne entered was one where trust was fragile, and betrayal could come from anywhere. Rivals were watching him closely, and older gang leaders weren't happy to see a young upstart gaining so much ground. The Garda, Ireland's police force, also had him in their sights. Reports were building, surveillance was increasing, and his name was becoming well known within law enforcement circles. Still, in those early years, Dunne seemed untouchable. The Northside was his territory, and he was its new dawn. Locals whispered his name with a mix of fear and awe. Parents warned their children not to get involved with his crew, while at the same time some admired the way he had risen from nothing to become someone powerful. His story was becoming the stuff of Dublin legend. Another young man who had turned to crime, not just to survive, but to dominate. Yet, even at the peak of his early success, the seeds of downfall were already being planted. The lifestyle he embraced came with enemies, and the more powerful he became, the more dangerous his world grew. In Dublin's underworld, no empire lasted forever, and every dawn eventually faced a reckoning. Chapter 1 closes with Eamon Dunne standing at the beginning of his reign. The city was changing, the underworld was shifting, and Dunne was rising faster than anyone had expected. The boy from Cabra had become the man who would rule the Northside. But as history has often shown, the higher the climb, the harder the fall. As the new millennium unfolded, Dublin's streets told two very different stories. In the glossy heart of the city, young professionals thrived on booming property markets and international investments. Meanwhile, in neighborhoods like Cabra, Finglas, and Ballymun, the shadow economy was just as alive, fueled by drug money and enforced by violence. It was here, within this underworld, that Eamon Dunne began to solidify his reputation, no longer just another face in the crowd, but a man steadily constructing an empire. Dunne's early reputation was built on his ability to inspire loyalty among those who followed him. He wasn't the kind of leader who ruled purely through fear, though he certainly could be ruthless when challenged. Instead, he offered his crew something rare in the chaotic, backstabbing world of crime: a sense of structure. Many of the young men who gravitated toward him came from broken homes, trapped in cycles of poverty and addiction. Dunne gave them jobs, money, and status. He positioned himself as a figure who could transform lives, at least for those willing to do his bidding. But the glue holding this growing empire together was drugs. By the early 2000s, cocaine had become the drug of choice across Dublin. It was no longer confined to elite parties or nightlife circles. It was spreading into working class communities, creating massive demand. Dunne recognized this shift and moved aggressively to control supply. He wasn't a smuggler himself. He wasn't the man steering boats or flying shipments into Ireland. But he had connections with bigger players who ensured a steady flow of product. Once the drugs were in Dublin, he became the man who controlled their distribution on the Northside. His operations were organized with military precision. Trusted lieutenants managed specific areas, ensuring that product moved efficiently from dealers to users. Money flowed upward, always making its way back to Dunne. Unlike smaller gangs that often stumbled into chaos, Dunne kept his house in order. Discipline was enforced, debts were collected swiftly, and anyone who betrayed him was dealt with harshly. The message was clear: loyalty was rewarded, disloyalty was fatal. With profits pouring in, Dunne's lifestyle began to reflect his growing status. Expensive sports cars, designer clothes, and high-profile appearances in Dublin's nightlife scene marked him as a man of influence. He wasn't shy about displaying wealth, and in doing so, he reinforced his image as someone untouchable. In clubs and pubs across the North Side, people knew who he was. They whispered his name, sometimes in admiration, sometimes in fear, but always with recognition of his power. Of course, in the world Dunne inhabited, success bred enemies. Rival gangs resented his rapid rise, and older criminal figures saw him as a threat. Turf wars in Dublin were nothing new, but Dunne's ambition meant that he was constantly pushing boundaries, expanding his reach into areas traditionally controlled by others. This inevitably led to clashes, sometimes violent, with groups who refused to yield. Dunne thrived in this environment. He understood that fear was as powerful as money, and he wasn't afraid to use violence to secure his dominance. One of the defining aspects of his leadership was his boldness. While many gang leaders preferred to stay in the shadows, keeping their operations discreet, Dunne had no problem being visible. He lived openly, almost daring his enemies or the authorities to challenge him. This high-profile approach made him a celebrity of sorts in Dublin's underworld. A man who walked into a pub and immediately commanded the room. To some, this was charisma. To others, it was recklessness that would eventually catch up with him. But Dunne wasn't just about personal image. He was strategic in building alliances. He recognized that in order to truly dominate the North Side, he needed more than just muscle. He needed connections. Over time, he cultivated relationships with other influential figures in the Irish criminal landscape, creating networks that extended beyond Dublin. These alliances gave him access to larger drug shipments and provided backup when conflicts escalated. At the same time, Dunne made sure to maintain his influence locally. In places like Cabra and Faussagh, he was both feared and respected. For some families, he was the man who brought danger to their doorsteps. corrupting their children with drugs. For others, he was the man who handed out money, who bought drinks at the bar, who ensured that certain neighborhoods felt protected under his watch. This duality, both menace and benefactor, was what made him such a complicated figure. He wasn't simply a gangster. He was a community presence, one whose impact was impossible to ignore. The Gardaí were also paying close attention. As Dunne's profile rose, so did law enforcement's determination to bring him down. His name appeared in intelligence reports, and surveillance operations began targeting his movements. But for all their efforts, Dunne proved difficult to pin down. He was careful enough to keep direct involvement in criminal transactions at a distance. Others took the risks while he reaped the rewards. On the streets, this made him look untouchable, and that image only added to his aura. Still, the dangers of his lifestyle never disappeared. Each time he expanded his operations, each time he crossed into new territory, he created more enemies. Assassination attempts and violent clashes became inevitable parts of his world. Yet Dunne carried himself as though nothing could harm him. To his followers, this confidence was inspiring. To his enemies, it was infuriating. To law enforcement, it was a reminder that they were dealing with a man who believed himself beyond their reach. By the mid-2000s, Eamon Dunne had achieved something few in Dublin's underworld could claim. He had become the undisputed king of the Northside. His network was vast, his wealth immense, and his reputation unshakable. The boy from Cabra had not only escaped the limits of his working class roots, he had redefined them by becoming a legend in the criminal world. But the higher his star rose, the more glaring the risks became. Rivals plotted in the shadows. The Garda tightened their grip, and whispers of betrayal began to circle his empire. Chapter 2 closes with Dunne at the height of his power. The Northside was his kingdom, and he ruled it with iron confidence. But history, especially in the world of organized crime, shows us that such peaks are often followed by devastating falls. For Eamon Dunne, the storm clouds were already gathering, even if he refused to see them. By the mid-2000s, Dublin's underworld had firmly taken shape into a battlefield of shifting loyalties, bloody feuds, and constant suspicion. For Eamon Dunne, success was never just about wealth or power. It was about survival. In the world he chose, every ally had the potential to become a traitor, and every rival was a possible executioner. As his empire expanded across the Northside, so too did the list of men who wanted to see him fall. The truth was that Dublin had never been short of dangerous figures. From the 1990s into the 2000s, Ireland had witnessed the rise of organized criminal networks that blurred the lines between local gangs and international drug cartels. Heroin had devastated entire neighborhoods in the 1980s and 1990s, and cocaine was now doing the same in the 2000s. Those who controlled the supply controlled lives, fortunes, and territories. It was inevitable that Dunne, as he tightened his grip over the Northside, would step on the toes of men who had built their own reputations long before his. Among his most significant enemies were rival Dublin gangs who had once dominated drug markets. Many older gang leaders despised Dunne, not only for his ambition, but also for his brazenness. Unlike the older generation, who understood the value of discretion, Dunne lived publicly, flaunting wealth and power in a way that attracted both envy and police attention. To the seasoned criminals of Dublin, this recklessness made him a liability to the delicate balance of the underworld. To them, Dunne wasn't just an upstart. He was a threat to their survival. The feuds were not always declared openly, but Dublin's streets bore the scars of these rivalries. Drive-by shootings, arson attacks, and targeted beatings became the language of warning and revenge. Every bullet fired in the Northside was a reminder that power came at a cost, and yet Dunne seemed unfazed. If anything, he thrived in the chaos, using each confrontation as an opportunity to display strength. He wanted his enemies to know he would not be intimidated. One of the most dangerous realities of Dunne's rise was his entanglement with international suppliers. While his street-level operations were rooted in Dublin, the drugs that fueled his empire came from far beyond Ireland. Connections with Spanish and Dutch cartels, as well as links to British and European criminal networks, meant that his operations touched borders that stretched across the continent. This international reach brought immense profits, but it also brought enemies who were far more dangerous than local rivals. These were men who commanded assassins, who operated with military precision, and who saw betrayal as something to be answered with swift, merciless violence locally. The rise of Dunne's Northside dominance triggered escalating tensions with other powerful factions in Dublin. The city was increasingly divided between areas controlled by different gangs, each fighting for a piece of the lucrative drug trade. The Gardiner Street feud, the Finglas clashes, and the broader conflicts involving the Kinahan and Hutch networks created a climate where murder became a routine headline. To ordinary Dubliners, the Gangland wars were terrifying. A shadow war fought in their neighborhoods, often spilling into public spaces where innocent lives could be caught in the crossfire. Dunne's enemies knew that to take him down, they couldn't just challenge him in open confrontation. He was too well protected, too well surrounded by loyalists who watched his back. Instead, they relied on patience, waiting for the right moment when he would slip, when arrogance or carelessness would expose him. In the underworld, death rarely came swiftly. It was often the result of weeks or months of plotting. Every move Dunne made was watched, every public appearance calculated against the possibility of ambush. Yet, despite the growing dangers, Dunne maintained his air of invincibility. To his followers, this fearlessness was magnetic. They saw him as a man who couldn't be touched, someone who walked through Dublin knowing his enemies were too afraid to strike. To outsiders, however, his confidence looked more like hubris, a blindness to the inevitability of what was coming. The Gardaí also understood the fragile balance that Dunne's enemies threatened to destroy. Each feud, each violent act pushed Dublin deeper into chaos. Law enforcement recognized that while they could attempt to arrest and convict, the greater danger lay in the Gangland wars erupting across the city. every feud meant more bloodshed, more funerals, and more instability. Dunne's position as a central figure in this violent network made him a priority target, not just for his crimes, but for the ripple effects they caused. Enemies also emerged from within. The higher Dunne climbed, the more paranoia seeped into his empire. In a business built on secrecy and loyalty, betrayal was inevitable. Associates who once swore allegiance could be tempted by money, by promises from rivals, or by fear of their own lives. Dunne understood this, which is why he ruled with both rewards and punishments. Those who stayed loyal were well paid and protected. Those who betrayed him disappeared or ended up as cautionary tales. But paranoia is corrosive, and even a man as calculating as Dunne could never fully escape the fear that someone close might one day turn against him. Still, what made Dunne so unique was his refusal to hide. Even as enemies circled, he continued to live publicly. He attended clubs, walked into pubs with confidence, and surrounded himself with people who projected strength. He wasn't the type to stay in the shadows, moving quietly between safe houses. He wanted to be seen, wanted everyone to know that he remained the Don of the Northside. This visibility made him both a legend and a target. Chapter 3 closes with Dublin's underworld on the brink of even greater violence. Eamon Dunne stood tall at the center of it all, his enemies multiplying with each passing year. From rival gangs to international suppliers, from old guard criminals to potential traitors within his own circle, danger surrounded him on all sides. Yet, he carried himself as if immune to fate. The Don of the Northside believed himself untouchable, but history shows us that such belief often marks the beginning of a downfall. By the mid to late 2000s, Eamon Dunne was no longer just another gangster operating on the north side of Dublin. He was the face of its underworld. His name carried weight not just in Cabra or Finglas, but across the city and beyond. To those who followed him, he was the Don, a man who had risen from the unforgiving streets to command an empire built on fear, loyalty, and rivers of drug money. For ordinary Dubliners, he was a ghostly presence. His reputation was everywhere, even if most people had never seen him in person. For rivals, he was a problem they could not ignore. And for the Garda, he was public enemy number one, a symbol of how deep Gangland influence had seeped into Irish society. At the peak of his power, Dunne controlled one of the most lucrative drug distribution networks in Dublin. Cocaine, ecstasy, cannabis. His fingerprints were on them all. The streets of the North Side moved at his command, from low-level dealers to mid-tier distributors. Every line of trade fed upward into his empire. He was not just making money. He was setting the pace of the entire market. His control was so widespread that even rival gangs often had to indirectly deal with his network to secure their supplies. This made him both indispensable and intolerable. Indispensable to those profiting from the trade, intolerable to those who wanted him out of the way. The profits Dunne reaped were staggering. He lived a lifestyle that left no doubt about his success. Luxury cars, top-of-the-line sports models, and sleek SUVs were regular features outside his home. His wardrobe carried the latest designer brands. His watches gleamed with wealth, and his presence in Dublin's nightlife was impossible to ignore. Clubs and bars became his stage, where he would arrive with an entourage, buy rounds for entire rooms, and make sure everyone knew he was there. He didn't just want to be rich. He wanted to be recognized as rich, but this visibility was more than just vanity. For Dunne, showing off his wealth was a statement. It was proof that he was untouchable, that despite the whispers, the threats, and the constant police attention, he remained in control. In a city where so many gangsters preferred to operate in the shadows, Dunne stood apart. He wanted his enemies to see him, to know that he was not afraid. This public life, however, would prove to be as dangerous as it was intoxicating. Despite the aura of glamour, Dunne's empire was never built on elegance. It was built on fear. His network operated with military-like efficiency because he made sure discipline was absolute. Debts were collected with violence, disloyalty was punished severely, and rivals who dared to challenge him often disappeared or ended up in shallow graves. To maintain power in Dublin's underworld required constant reminders of strength. Every so often, when whispers of dissent surfaced, Dunne would ensure that an example was made. His reputation as ruthless was not just rumor, it was reality, reinforced by blood. Still, there was another side to his leadership. Those close to him often spoke of his charisma, his ability to draw people in and make them feel part of something larger. He wasn't just feared, he was admired, even loved, by some of his followers. Young men who had grown up with little hope saw in him a model of success. However twisted it might have been, he gave them money, status, and a sense of belonging. In the bleak streets of the Northside, being associated with Eamon Dunne was both a shield and a source of pride. But for every loyalist, there was an enemy waiting in the wings. Dunne's rise had left a trail of bitter rivals, many of whom had lost ground, money, or respect because of him. The older generation of Dublin criminals saw him as reckless. To them, he was a brash young don who attracted too much attention, both from the media and the Garda. They understood that survival in the underworld depended on keeping a low profile, but Dunne seemed to thrive on the spotlight. This made him a target, not just for assassination, but for betrayal. The Garda, too, intensified their pursuit. Surveillance on Dunne became a near constant operation. They monitored his movements, tracked his financial dealings, and gathered intelligence from informants within the criminal world. Still, convicting him proved difficult. Dunne was careful not to leave a trail that could directly tie him to the drugs or the murders associated with his name. He insulated himself with layers of loyal men who carried out the dirty work while he sat at the top, pulling the strings. To the public, this only reinforced the myth of his invincibility. And yet, even in his strongest years, cracks were beginning to show. The more he flaunted his wealth, the more visible he became to his enemies. Every night out in a Dublin club was another opportunity for rivals to plot his downfall. Every new car he drove was a reminder that his empire was funded by blood and addiction. Every show of strength made him both admired and hated in equal measure. In this way, Dunne lived a life of contradictions. He was the Don of the Northside, commanding fear and respect. He was also a man who courted danger by refusing to hide, who believed his power was enough to shield him from the fate that had claimed so many before him. His story at this point was one of triumph, but also of inevitability. Dublin's underworld had a long history of kings who rose and fell, and the higher Dunne climbed, the more certain it became that his reign would not last forever. Chapter 4 closes with Eamon Dunne at his zenith, a man who had transformed himself from a boy in Cabra into the most powerful gangster on Dublin's north side. His empire was vast, his wealth undeniable, and his reputation unshakable. But the shadows around him were growing darker, filled with rivals, police, and potential traitors. In the underworld, the peak of power is often just the prelude to downfall. And for Eamon Dunne, the descent was closer than he ever imagined. At the height of his reign, Eamon Dunne appeared untouchable. He had the cars, the money, the clubs, the army of loyal young men who followed his every command. To the outside world, he was a king sitting on top of Dublin's north side, controlling the flow of drugs, the rhythm of violence, and the currency of fear. But inside his empire, things were beginning to shift. Power, as history often reminds us, is never permanent. And for Dunne, the first cracks were already appearing long before he realized how fragile his kingdom truly was. The most dangerous threat to any criminal empire rarely comes from outside rivals. Instead, it comes from within. For all his ruthlessness and charisma, Dunne was ruling a world built on fear and greed, and those forces eventually erode loyalty. Many of the men closest to him were loyal not out of love, but out of necessity. They feared what would happen if they crossed him, and they thrived on the money and status that came with standing at his side. But fear breeds resentment, and greed is never satisfied. Some began to question whether their loyalty was worth the risks, especially as the Garda increased pressure on Dunne's operation. The Garda had long been frustrated by Dunne's ability to avoid conviction. Surveillance operations painted a clear picture of his influence, but connecting him directly to crimes proved nearly impossible. Still, the police understood the value of information, and they began leaning harder on Dunne's associates. Every arrest, every questioning was a chance to turn someone. Slowly but surely, the noose was tightening, not through a single strike, but through the erosion of trust inside Dunne's own circle. At the same time, Dunne's public lifestyle was starting to work against him. His flashy appearances in clubs, his high-profile spending, his refusal to hide, all of it made him a target. Rivals didn't need to hunt for him. They knew where he was most weekends. His arrogance, once a symbol of strength, was now interpreted as recklessness. In the world of organized crime, visibility is a weakness, and Dunne's refusal to stay in the shadows created opportunities for those who wanted him gone. Betrayal, too, began to seep into the edges of his empire. In a world driven by money, there is always someone willing to trade secrets for survival or profit. Dunne was paranoid by nature. He understood that trust was dangerous, but paranoia can be as destructive as betrayal itself. He began to suspect those around him, questioning their loyalty, tightening his grip, and ruling with an even harsher hand. The more he demanded obedience, the more cracks widened among his crew. Some who once saw him as a leader began to see him as a liability. Outside forces were also converging. Rival gangs had long bided their time, waiting for Dunne to slip. His growing paranoia made him less careful, and his enemies sensed the shift. Feuds that had simmered in the background for years were reignited, fueled by old grudges and new opportunities. In Dublin, Gangland wars were cyclical. Each new king eventually became the target of the next uprising. For Dunne, his position at the top made him the most obvious target of all. But perhaps the most insidious enemy was complacency. Success can blind even the sharpest minds, and Dunne began to believe his own myth of invincibility. He brushed off warnings, ignored whispers of plots, and dismissed the danger of betrayal. To him, fear was still his greatest weapon, and he believed it would be enough to keep enemies and traitors at bay. What he failed to see was that fear has limits. When men feel cornered, when they believe survival depends on turning against their leader, fear loses its power. For the Gardaí, the cracks in Dunne's empire were opportunities. Informants began to emerge, quietly feeding information about his movements, his operations, and his vulnerabilities. Some were motivated by money, others by self-preservation. In the underworld, cooperation with the police was a death sentence if discovered, but desperation made it possible. Each piece of intelligence added to the growing picture of a king losing control. Meanwhile, Dunne's violent responses to suspected betrayal only deepened his problems. Each act of revenge created new enemies. Families were shattered, neighborhoods scarred, and old alliances broken. The cycle of violence that had once secured his dominance now threatened to consume him. For every rival silenced, two more seemed to rise. For every traitor punished, whispers of discontent grew louder. And yet, in public, Dunne maintained the same fearless image. He still walked into pubs with confidence, still threw money around in clubs, still carried himself like a man beyond reach. To his followers, this confidence was intoxicating. To his enemies, it was an open invitation. And to the Garda, it was proof that his downfall would not come quietly. By the late 2000s, Eamon Dunne's empire was still vast, but it was no longer stable. The cracks were widening, the foundations trembling under the weight of paranoia, betrayal, and relentless enemies. His reign was at its most dangerous point, not because he had lost power, but because he had too much of it, spread too thin, challenged from all sides. The dawn of the Northside was still standing tall, but the storm gathering around him was stronger than ever. Chapter 5 closes with Dunne's empire beginning to fracture. What once seemed unshakable was now vulnerable, eroded by enemies within and without. He remained the Dawn, but his crown was slipping, and in the underworld of Dublin, once a king shows weakness, the vultures begin to circle. By the late 2000s, Dublin was a city caught between two worlds. On the surface, Ireland was still enjoying the glow of its Celtic tiger years. Cafes were full, new apartments lined the skyline, and prosperity seemed to touch every corner of daily life. But beneath that polished exterior, the streets told a very different story. Violence was surging, drug money was fueling entire neighborhoods, and whispers of feuds and betrayals echoed through the pubs and housing estates of the Northside. At the center of it all stood Eamon Dunne. The Don of the Northside was no longer just a gangster. He had become a symbol of Dublin's Gangland culture. His control of the drug trade was unmatched, his reputation firmly established. But with power came the inevitable consequence: war. Rival factions, once weakened or sidelined by Dunne's rise, were now fighting back. The city was sliding deeper into bloodshed, and Dunne's name was stamped on nearly every headline that spoke of Gangland killings. The feuds that erupted during these years were not isolated events. They were part of a broader cycle of violence that had haunted Dublin for decades. Families were torn apart as brothers, cousins, and childhood friends found themselves on opposite sides of the conflict. Entire neighborhoods lived under a cloud of fear, knowing that gunfire could erupt without warning, that a feud between criminals could spill onto innocent streets. For ordinary citizens, it was a nightmare that seemed endless. For Dunne, it was simply the cost of doing business. He thrived in the chaos, at least outwardly. Each assassination attempt he survived, each rival that fell, added to his aura of invincibility. He carried himself as though fate was on his side, as though the bullets aimed at him could never hit their mark. To his followers, this made him larger than life. They spoke of him as if he were untouchable, a man blessed or cursed, with immunity from death. But history has shown us that in the underworld, such belief is always an illusion. The Gardaí watched the escalating violence with alarm. Each feud, each murder, threatened to destabilize not just the criminal world, but the safety of Dublin itself. Surveillance on Dunne intensified. Every move was tracked, every associate scrutinized, every phone call analyzed. Intelligence painted a clear picture. Dunne was both orchestrator and target, a man whose actions were feeding a cycle of revenge that showed no signs of slowing. Yet despite the pressure, he continued to walk openly through the city, daring anyone to challenge him. The assassination attempts grew bolder. Rumors circulated constantly, plots to ambush him outside clubs, snipers waiting in parked cars, gunmen stalking his movements. Some attempts were foiled by chance, others by Dunne's sheer confidence in surrounding himself with heavily armed guards. But the reality was undeniable. His enemies were determined, and their patience was running out. Each failed attempt only deepened their resolve. They understood that to truly destabilize Dublin's Gangland, Dunne had to be removed. Inside his own empire, paranoia spread like wildfire. Dunne knew he was a target, and this knowledge seeped into every decision he made. He trusted fewer people, demanded more loyalty, and punished even the slightest suspicion of betrayal with violence. Associates who once felt empowered by his leadership now lived in fear of his wrath. The very fear that had secured his throne was now corroding it from within. The tighter he gripped, the more people looked for ways out. The violence of the Gangland wars touched every layer of society. Children grew up hearing gunfire at night. Families mourned loved ones caught in crossfire, and neighborhoods became defined not by their communities, but by their allegiances to rival gangs. Dublin, for all its prosperity, was bleeding from within. And at the heart of it all, Eamon Dunne continued to play the role of the untouchable Don, seemingly blind to the inevitability of his fate. Yet even Dunne could not ignore the scale of the bloodshed. Each funeral he attended was a reminder that his empire was built on fragile ground. Each rival eliminated created new grudges, new vendettas waiting to unfold. The Gangland wars were not battles that could be won. They were endless cycles of violence that consumed everyone involved. Still, Dunne pushed forward, convinced that his power was strong enough to outlast the storm. But history was not on his side. Dublin's underworld had seen many kings before him, men who believed themselves untouchable, only to fall to the same fate: betrayal, bullets, and blood on the streets. Dunne's story was following the same path, even if he refused to see it. The more he fought to secure his dominance, the more enemies he created. The more public his life became, the easier it was to target him. The more he punished betrayal, the more likely betrayal became. Chapter 6 closes with Dublin in the grip of escalating Gangland wars, its streets stained with the violence of feuds that seemed without end. At the center, Eamon Dunne remained defiant, living boldly in the face of death, convinced that fear and power would shield him from the fate that had claimed so many before. But as history has shown time and again, no Don remains untouchable forever. The storm around him was growing, and sooner or later it would break. By the dawn of 2010, the aura surrounding Eamon Dunne had begun to shift. For nearly a decade, he had ruled the Northside of Dublin with ruthless authority, walking through clubs and pubs like a man immune to fate, untouchable in the eyes of his followers and feared by rivals. But beneath the surface, his empire was weakening. The weight of paranoia, the constant plotting of enemies, and the relentless pressure from law enforcement were converging. The dawn of the North Side was still standing tall, but cracks in the foundation had widened into fractures. His fall was no longer a question of if, it was a question of when. Arrogance had always been part of Dunne's character, but in his final years, it grew unchecked. He believed too deeply in his own legend, the myth of invincibility that his followers had repeated for years. Each time he walked into a packed nightclub, each time he arrived at a pub with his entourage, each time he flaunted his wealth openly, he was sending a message: he could not be touched. But the more he declared his invulnerability, the more determined his enemies became to prove him wrong. The Garda saw the same arrogance. Their intelligence files on Dunne had grown thick with reports of his movements, his associates, and his crimes. Surveillance painted him as the most visible gangster in Dublin, a man who practically dared the state to stop him. For investigators, the challenge was not identifying him as a threat. It was gathering the evidence to dismantle his empire. Yet even as the Gardaí intensified their efforts, they knew that Dunne's greatest threat did not come from law enforcement. It came from within the underworld itself. Whispers of betrayal grew louder in those final years. Associates who once stood proudly at Dunne's side began to distance themselves. Some feared the Gardaí's pressure, others feared rivals, and many simply feared that being close to Dunne had become too dangerous. His paranoia, already strong, deepened. He trusted fewer men, demanded greater loyalty, and punished disobedience with escalating violence. These measures may have secured control in the short term, but they also isolated him. A king surrounded by walls of fear is a king who stands alone. Rivals, too, had grown bolder. The Gangland wars of the 2000s had thinned the field. But Dunne's dominance made him the single largest target left standing. Eliminating him was not just about revenge, it was about opportunity. His death would leave a vacuum in the Northside, one that others could rush to fill. For rival factions, Dunne's arrogance and visibility were gifts. He made himself easy to find, easy to study, and eventually easy to ambush. Despite these dangers, Dunne continued to live as though immune. He still appeared at Dublin's most popular clubs, still threw money across bars, still projected the image of a man untouched by fear. To his followers, it was inspiring. To his enemies, it was reckless. To those who truly understood the underworld, it was a death sentence waiting to be written. In these final years, Dunne's enemies were not just watching, they were planning. Professional assassins were hired, plots were drawn, and information was quietly exchanged. His routines were studied, his favorite haunts mapped out, his movements anticipated. Assassination in the underworld is rarely spontaneous. It is calculated, precise, and executed only when success is assured. By 2010, the calculations were nearly complete. At the same time, Dunne's own actions accelerated his downfall. His empire was bleeding from within. Loyalists questioning their place, rivals circling like vultures, and police pressure increasing every day. Instead of retreating into caution, Dunne leaned further into bravado. He acted as though survival was guaranteed, as though the rules of the underworld that had claimed so many others could not apply to him. This belief, more than any enemy, sealed his fate. For Dublin, the climate around Dunne's final years was one of fear and inevitability. Newspapers carried endless stories of Gangland shootings. Communities mourned young men, pulled into feuds, and whispers in pubs spoke of when, not if, the dawn of the Northside would be struck down. Ordinary citizens avoided places they knew he frequented, fearful of being caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. His presence was both magnetic and menacing, a living reminder of the violence that haunted the city. By early 2010, Dunne was living on borrowed time. Rivals were prepared, his circle was eroding, and the myth of his invincibility was wearing thin. Yet he remained blind to the storm around him. He believed, as he always had, that fear and respect would protect him. But fear is fragile, and respect in the underworld lasts only as long as power endures. April 23, 2010. For most people in Dublin, it was an ordinary Friday evening. The work week was ending, pubs were filling with laughter, and the city prepared itself for another lively weekend. But for Eamon Dunne, it was a night that would etch his name forever into Ireland's Gangland history. What began as a celebration would end as his execution. That night, Dunne arrived at the Faussagh house, pub in Cabra, a place well known in the community. He was attending a friend's birthday party, a gathering that, on the surface, seemed harmless. Music played, glasses clinked, and the air was light with chatter. But Dunne's presence cast a shadow over the room. Everyone knew who he was. To some, his attendance gave the party an air of prestige. To others, it brought a gnawing sense of dread. Wherever Dunne went, danger followed. He carried himself with the same arrogance that had defined him for years. Surrounded by friends and loyalists, he laughed loudly, drank freely, and made no attempt to conceal his identity. He didn't wear disguise or caution. He was the Don of the Northside, and he behaved as though the world should know it. His reputation was his armor, and in his mind, that was enough. But outside the pub, the night was taking on a different rhythm. Unknown to Dunne, the men who had plotted his downfall were already in motion. Weeks of surveillance had led to this moment. His routines had been studied, his habits memorized. The choice of location was deliberate. Here, in a crowded pub, his enemies knew he would feel safe, surrounded by laughter and ordinary people. But safety, for Dunne, was an illusion. Inside, the atmosphere grew heavier as the night wore on. Dunne's loud presence dominated the room. Some guests whispered quietly. Others kept their eyes on the door, half expecting something terrible to happen. Even among his own circle, paranoia lingered. They knew he had enemies, knew he was a marked man. But Dunne brushed it all aside. He had survived every attempt before. Why should this night be any different? At around 10:00 p.m., the illusion shattered. Gunmen stormed into the pub, their weapons drawn, their movements swift and merciless. Chaos erupted in an instant. Screams filled the air. Glasses shattered, people dove for cover. But for Eamon Dunne, there was no escape. The assassins moved directly toward him, their mission precise. In a hail of bullets, the Don of the Northside fell. The execution was brutal, but calculated. Dunne was struck multiple times, the gunmen ensuring there would be no survival, no miraculous escape as in years past. Within moments, the man who had ruled Dublin's Northside with iron authority lay lifeless on the pub floor. The myth of invincibility, nurtured for so long, was destroyed in a single burst of gunfire. Panic swept through the room. Guests scrambled to flee, some crying, others frozen in shock. For the people who had come to celebrate a birthday, the night had transformed into a nightmare. The sound of gunfire echoed in their ears, and the sight of Dunne's body was a reminder of how close they had come to gangland violence that spared no one. The gunmen fled swiftly, disappearing into the shadows of Dublin's night. For them, the job was done. Years of rivalry, months of planning, and countless whispers had culminated in this moment. Dunne was dead, and with him, the era of his dominance ended abruptly. News of the shooting spread like wildfire. Within minutes, Word traveled through Dublin's underworld. Phones buzzed, voices whispered, and by the early hours of the morning, the city knew Eamon Dunne was gone. To his enemies, it was a victory. To his associates, it was a collapse. To the Garda, it was confirmation of what they had long anticipated, that Dunnan's recklessness would one day catch up with him. In the aftermath, the pub became a crime scene, its walls marked by bullet holes, its floors stained with the blood of the dawn. Gardaí swarmed the area, cordoning off streets, interviewing witnesses, and collecting evidence. But as with so many Gangland assassinations, the gunmen vanished without a trace. Silence protected them, fear ensured no cooperation, and justice remained elusive. For the people of Cabra, the killing was a grim reminder of the violence that had plagued their neighborhoods. Children would walk past the pub in the days that followed, asking questions their parents struggled to answer. Ordinary citizens felt a mix of relief and unease. Relief that the man who brought danger everywhere he went was gone, but unease knowing that his death could ignite further bloodshed. Dunne's killing marked not just the end of a man, but the end of an era. The dawn of the Northside, who had once walked Dublin's streets with untouchable arrogance, now lay cold, his empire thrown into chaos. His enemies had succeeded where others had failed, proving once again that no gangster, no matter how feared, could escape the inevitable fate of betrayal and bullets. The morning after the murder of Eamon Dunne, Dublin awoke to a city forever changed. The headlines were stark, the words heavy with finality. Crime boss gunned down in Cabra. For years, Dunne had lived as though untouchable, his name whispered with a mix of fear and reluctant admiration. But now, the dawn of the Northside was gone, and in his absence, both chaos and opportunity loomed. News spread quickly across the city, traveling from street corners to kitchens, from pubs to offices. For ordinary Dubliners, the killing was both shocking and inevitable. Many had long predicted that Dunne's arrogance would lead to his death, yet seeing it in print, seeing photographs of the pub, Garda at the scene, and the grim headlines still felt unreal. The myth of invincibility had shattered, and in its place was the reality of a man slain by the same violence he had dealt to so many others. The Gardaí treated the killing as a watershed moment. Their intelligence units had tracked Dunne for years, but the underworld had resolved what the justice system could not. Officially, statements called the murder part of an ongoing criminal feud. Unofficially, many investigators admitted that his death, while tragic, may have prevented countless further killings. Still, they braced themselves for the consequences. Assassinations in Dublin's Gangland never ended with the victim. They sparked chains of revenge, fractured alliances, and opened bloody struggles for power. In the neighborhoods Dunne once ruled, reactions were mixed. Some felt a quiet relief, believing the streets might finally calm without his shadow looming over them. Others feared the opposite, that his death would only unleash more violence as rivals and former allies scrambled to claim his empire. Mothers clutched their children tighter, wary that gunfire could erupt again. Young men who once idolized Dunne wondered who would take his place, who would rise as the new face of Dublin's criminal world. The days that followed were marked by both mourning and tension. Dunne's funeral drew crowds that reflected the dual nature of his life. Family, friends, and associates came to pay respects, lining the streets as his coffin was carried. Floral tributes spelled out his nickname, and mourners wept openly. But alongside them stood Garda surveillance teams, watching carefully for signs of future feuds. Rival gangs observed too, some mocking quietly, others calculating their next move. To them, the funeral was not just an end. It was the opening of a new chapter in the Gangland Wars. The sight of Dunne's coffin, draped in flowers and carried past the people of Cabra, was a surreal moment. For those who grew up with him, he was still the boy they had once known, the neighbor who played football on the streets. For others, he was a symbol of the violence that had scarred their community. In that procession, grief and bitterness mingled. Even in death, Dunne divided opinion. Behind closed doors, the vacuum he left was already pulling gangs into conflict. Dunne had controlled much of Dublin's drug trade, his word final, his reach extending across the Northside. Without him, lieutenants argued, rivals plotted, and the delicate balance of fear that had kept the underworld in order collapsed. Each faction saw opportunity, but opportunity in Gangland was always paved with blood. The Garda anticipated this and tightened their operations, deploying more officers, increasing surveillance, and preparing for the surge of violence that seemed inevitable. But they also understood a deeper truth. Dunne's murder had not ended Dublin's Gangland. It had simply reshaped it. Another man, or perhaps several, would step into the vacuum. The cycle was relentless, and history had shown it would not stop with Dunne. For ordinary citizens, the weeks after his death carried a strange mix of calm and unease. On one hand, the most visible and feared gangster in Dublin was gone, a fact that brought a measure of relief. On the other, the uncertainty of who might rise next left communities on edge. People avoided pubs and clubs Dunne once frequented, wary of becoming bystanders in future attacks. Fear lingered in conversations, in glances exchanged across crowded streets, in the silence that fell whenever his name was mentioned. Yet beneath the fear, there was also a quiet reflection. Dunne's story was not just about crime and violence. It was about the choices that shaped a life. Many in Dublin asked themselves how a boy from the Northside had become the city's most feared gangster. His death became a cautionary tale, told in schools and homes as a warning to young men tempted by the quick money and false glamour of the underworld. Parents pointed to his fate as proof that the life of a gangster always ended the same way: prison or the grave. Still, the legend of Eamon Dunne persisted. In some circles, he was remembered as a man who defied the system, who lived without fear, who embodied a kind of twisted heroism. In others, he was reviled as a thug who brought nothing but misery to his community. Both versions of him lived on, woven into Dublin's collective memory. In the years since Eamon Dunne's violent death, Dublin has continued to evolve. But his story remains etched into the city's memory. The dawn of the Northside is gone, his empire dismantled, his enemies victorious. Yet the echoes of his reign still linger in the streets he once ruled. His life and death serve as both a cautionary tale and a reminder of the enduring grip of organized crime on Ireland's capital. For those who lived through the height of Dunne's power, his legacy is impossible to ignore. He embodied the contradictions of Dublin's underworld, ruthless yet charismatic, reckless yet calculating, feared yet oddly admired. To some, he was a man who rose from nothing to control an empire, a symbol of raw ambition unchecked by morality. To others, he was a criminal who left behind a trail of broken families, ruined lives, and communities scarred by violence. Both views are true, and together they form the complex shadow he left behind. The Garda, in reflecting on Dunne's reign, often describe his story as inevitable. He lived in defiance of the law, flaunted his wealth and power openly, and built an empire on violence. His murder, they argue, was not just the result of rivals, but of his own arrogance. By making himself a public figure in a world that thrives on secrecy, he painted a target on his back. In the end, the same arrogance that elevated him also destroyed him. For Dublin's communities, his death brought mixed emotions that linger even today. Some residents of the Northside remember the fear he instilled, the nights when gunfire echoed through the streets, the funerals of young men caught up in his wars. Others recall him as a familiar figure, someone they grew up alongside, a neighbor who had chosen the wrong path. In conversations, his name is still spoken with a mix of fear, bitterness, and reluctant fascination. Among younger generations, Dunne's story has taken on an almost mythic quality. In some circles, he is remembered like a character from folklore, part villain, part anti-hero. His lifestyle, his confidence, his violent end, all feed into the image of the gangster as a figure larger than life. But parents and teachers point to his story as a warning: the path of crime leads only to death or prison. His downfall is used as evidence that no matter how powerful a gangster becomes, the cycle of violence will claim them in the end. The underworld itself learned lessons from Dunne's fate: his visibility, his arrogance, his tendency to flaunt power. These became cautionary mistakes for those who followed. Later generations of criminals operated more quietly, less publicly, learning from the errors that had left Dunne so vulnerable. In this way, his death reshaped Dublin's Gangland, altering how others conducted business in the years that followed. Yet the violence did not end with him. His assassination, while closing one chapter, opened others. Rival gangs fought to claim the empire he left behind, and new figures rose to fill the vacuum. For Dublin, Dunne's death was a moment of change, but not of peace. The cycle continued, as it always had. His name became one more in a long list of fallen Gangland leaders, each of them convinced of their own invincibility until the inevitable end arrived. What makes Dunne's story stand out, however, is not just his death, but the scale of his presence while alive. Few gangsters in Dublin's history carried themselves with such public defiance. Few dared to be as visible, as brash, as confident in their supposed untouchability. His reign was not hidden in shadows. It was lived openly, almost theatrically, in clubs, pubs, and neighborhoods where everyone knew who he was. That openness is part of why his story remains so vivid in collective memory. Eamon Dunne's legacy also extends beyond crime. His life and death reflect broader truths about power, fear, and human ambition. He represents how quickly authority built on violence can crumble, how fear can both sustain and destroy a leader, and how arrogance blinds even the most powerful to the inevitability of their fate. In many ways, his story mirrors those of gangsters across history and around the world. A rise built on fear, a reign marked by violence, and an end delivered by betrayal and bullets. In Dublin today, his name surfaces whenever discussions of Gangland violence arise. Journalists reference him as a turning point in Ireland's underworld. Criminologists study his rise and fall, and communities still carry the scars of the violence he helped perpetuate. The Faussagh House pub, the site of his assassination, remains a stark reminder of how close gangland violence can cut into the fabric of ordinary life. And so, the story of Eamon Dunne closes not with triumph, but with a lesson. He was a man who lived boldly, who built an empire through fear, who believed himself untouchable. But like every dawn before him, he was proven wrong. His death on a pub floor in Cabra was the final act in a story that had always been heading toward one of two endings: a prison cell or a grave. For Dunne, it was the latter.